an honor and a pleasure to host a very important person from the American Embassy. John Law is a deputy of the mission. He can actually get you a visa.
They don't let me do stuff.
They don't know he can. Sorry, but the door's locked. No one leaves the room. Okay, that's he's an enthusiast of teaching, and you can see that he knows what he's doing. John is a seasoned diplomat. I mean, when I say seasoned, I mean experienced.
That means old.
No, I wanted to avoid. No, they can see that you're not old. I mean, seasoned and tested. Because imagine what, when I'm reading where he was, and you can see, wow, these are all the places where Americans had to do something with the dictators or wars. I don't know what your role was in the Panama, although recent, before, long after Noriega. So you had probably nothing to do with this. But Panama, Kabul, which is where? Come on, that was a joke and stupid question. Kabul is where? Afghanistan, yes. He coordinated work of, you can imagine what it's like to coordinate work of over 400 people dispersed through the country, field workers. That might be interesting to ask him how he managed to do this, although coordinating things is something which Mr. Law does very well. In Panama, he coordinated the work of about 25, as it says here, 25 American government agencies, almost like a president. Maybe even tougher. The president can always say, "I'm the president." And he served his terms in different places, and in Prague, Madrid, Caracas, and Chile, and South Korea. Therefore, he speaks many languages: Polish, Spanish, Korean, French, and Czech. And Polish again, because I know to speak Polish quite well.
English.
And English for English. We'll see this. And what should be most interesting for you, that's when you think, career diplomat, so many missions, and probably a graduate of international relations or some political science or something. No. Literature. Yes. English literature. People like you, I can't say there's a career for you in America. There's diplomacy, but people who are open-minded and so liberal arts inclined people are needed everywhere. So English literature, philosophy, engineering, designing planes. How do you move from English literature to designing planes?
I decided I didn't really like math.
You didn't like math? Oh, so first it was too late. And wasn't there a crash involved?
No, because in a U.S. university you can change pretty easily.
That's true. So, and he's happily married, 2 granddaughters also. One of them, Zara, when you go shopping, you see her name. She does her stores all over the world. And so, John, it's a pleasure for us to host you here, and you will be talking about, casually talking, exchanging views with us on what it takes to win, on what determines who wins and why people win. And all the time as you're sitting here, you're thinking about questions. I want questions. John wants questions, because it's not a typical lecture where he will stand here and talk for an hour and 30 minutes. No, a short talk, and then questions. And so much is happening in America. You can ask questions on almost any issue. If it's inappropriate, he will tell you in a diplomatic way that it was not an appropriate question. So think about questions, yes? And since I know that there are people in the classroom whose job this semester has been to follow the elections, and I'm sure you have questions about the things which we may not understand so well in Poland. Mr. John Long, John, thank you. And we owe his coming here to Dr. Mazu, who invited John, and he was kind enough to say enthusiastically yes. So the floor is yours, and the board's there, the marker is there, and
Thank you.
It's 9 on this.
Well, thank you. I'm very happy to be here. I'm very happy to have a chance to speak with you. If I speak too quickly, or if, as is more likely, I speak English ungrammatically and you don't understand something, please ask me to explain it again. And while I don't speak Polish that well, but if you need to ask a question in Polish, I will probably understand it. I'll try to speak relatively informally. And I hope that you will have questions. First, I should admit that the title is a little bit misleading, because saying what decides who wins suggests that I know what's going to happen. And I think this year has been a very good example that nobody knows what's going to happen in US politics. Nobody really understands how things happen. You may have heard of an American comedian named Will Rogers, who in the last century was very popular before the days of television. And commenting on the politics of his era, he said that when he was a little boy, his mother told him that absolutely anybody could be president of the United States. And the older he got, the more he believed that that indeed was true. It's absolutely anybody becomes president. And we might see that happen this year. I could try to tell you that these are all carefully scientifically researched explanations of what happens in a US election, but that would be a lie. Because the fact is that there are only 57 presidential elections in the United States history, and at least half of those are completely irrelevant for trying to understand what happens now. The fact is that if I really wanted to try to, I could tell you that you can find elements of today's campaign in the campaigns at the end of the 19th century of William Jennings Bryan. Or maybe you can find elements in today's politics in the populist era at the beginning of the 20th century. But the fact is that in modern US presidential election history, there are only 11 elections. 1968 was when we changed the system completely. Before 1968, there were some primary elections, there were some caucuses. They did not decide who the winner was. If you've studied the history of that time, you know that the Democrats had as their candidate that year Hubert Humphrey, who was the vice president, who had not participated in a single primary election. Robert Kennedy had, and then Kennedy was assassinated. Eugene McCarthy was the next candidate who had won many of the primary elections. Humphrey came in at the end and decided, I could be president. He didn't, he lost. But there was such a hostility to the way that the professional politicians had taken over the nomination process that the Democratic Party changed all of the rules. They had a young senator from the state of South Dakota named George McGovern who changed the way that they elect their candidates, and then coincidentally, a couple of years later, he became the candidate and lost terribly. But that explains the modern history. We have 11 elections since 1972. If this were a science class or a mathematics class, what people would tell you is that's an extremely small sample size. It's very difficult to draw conclusions from only 11 elections. But I think that I can probably point to 10 factors that really will decide who wins in most American elections. And at the end, I believe I can probably give you 5 points that if you really want to know before it happens, there are 5 things to look for. It's a little bit early for 4 of them. but they can tell you who is probably going to become president in 10 months. And of course, since one of these people will be my boss, I should clarify this is absolutely not official U.S. government policy, and I'm not going to say anything bad about any of the candidates. First, I'd like to start talking about what absolutely does not matter whatsoever, because it's misleading. You'll hear people talk about it, but it has no importance. If you think back to 1968, when Hubert Humphrey became the candidate, how was that possible? A man who had not won a single election, not even participated, didn't get a single vote during the entire primary season. And the way it happened was every party has a convention. The parties this year have their convention in July, and both of the parties will officially nominate their candidate. You'll know who the candidate is, almost certainly, before those conventions happen. One exception, which we can talk about a little bit later. But from 1968 before, that was not always true. It was the convention that decided who the candidate was going to be. And the convention were the political professionals of each party who made those decisions. That has now changed. As you probably know, next Monday, the primary season in the United States will officially begin. Iowa is going to have what it calls a caucus. We'll talk about that in a minute. And then the following week, on February 9th, New Hampshire will have a primary election. And then other states will follow with usually primaries, but a handful of states still do their caucuses. Those are in order to gain delegates. And the delegates will then go to the convention. The delegates have to vote, in most cases, for the candidate who won that state's election. The convention, again, 45 years ago, it mattered because a delegate at a convention could decide, I don't want to support Eugene McCarthy, I'm going to support Vice President Humphrey. They can't do that anymore. And so even though people will talk a lot about the conventions, and the conventions last a week, and they're extremely good for the balloon industry and the funny hat industry because they all buy those things. Convention has absolutely no importance in selecting the candidate. It has absolutely no importance in deciding who will win. I can guarantee you that the week that the Republicans have their convention, the public opinion surveys are going to show a few points up for that person. The following week, the Democrats have their convention, and their person will go up by a few points. And then the following week, everything will be back to where it was before. Conventions have no impact whatsoever. As long as we're talking about things that don't make any difference, and this is painful, I know, to some of the politicians, there will be a lot of interest in who the vice presidential candidate will be. Political scientists have looked at this every way, and you may hear people will say, for example, Senator McCain's selection of Sarah Palin cost him the election. There's no evidence for that whatsoever. It doesn't appear that anybody bases their vote on who the vice president is. Probably the vice president candidate does. And if that person's lucky, maybe their immediate family will also vote for them. But not too many other people change their vote based on the vice presidential candidate. It's basically about the presidential candidate. But sometimes the convention will announce who the vice presidential candidate will be. Again, usually you know before. So that doesn't matter. There will be a handful of people, if you're a real political addict like I am, and you like to read every article, you'll have all of the experts talking about the party's platform, its policy proposals. Completely does not matter. Absolutely doesn't matter. Ignore it. Because the candidate does not have to follow it if he or she wins the election. Nobody who's voting for that party is going to read it because it's that thick. The political addicts, the junkies who love politics will read these things and talk about it. There's no influence whatsoever. So don't waste your time reading the party platform. I'm sorry if that contradicts anything that you're supposed to do in class, but they really shouldn't do it.
No, we are not teaching them United States Information Agency material, that used to be published in the old system that said that...
Yes, that is, again, as I said, this is not counting as official U.S. government policy. These are my private views. Another thing that absolutely doesn't matter, all of these experts who are writing articles in the newspapers and on the internet and appearing on television and who are saying we're trying to persuade you about a certain candidate, we're trying to argue that some candidates are right or wrong on gun control or their economic policy or things like that, ignore them. They have almost no impact on voters' decisions, it appears. What they do have, and we can talk about this a little bit later when we start talking about things that do matter, is that if enough of them are talking about a certain issue, that can raise public interest in the issue, and that can affect who decides to go vote. And that is a critical factor in deciding who wins. But most of the time, these are a handful of academic experts who are in a closed room, talking among themselves, having very interesting conversations that the average voter is not really going to pay attention to. And certainly not 10 months before the election, where we are right now. And then the last thing, and this is going to come as a shock, so I'm glad that everybody is sitting down. Occasionally you will have a Hollywood actor decide to endorse a certain political candidate. It doesn't matter. The bulk of the American population does not believe that Hollywood actors are always experts on geopolitical issues. And so we will not always take advice from Lena Dunham or Robert Redford or Clint Eastwood about who we should vote for. There's Oprah, again, that might be a little bit different. She's the exception. But for the most part, nobody cares anymore. You'll also see the media, newspapers especially, will tend to endorse candidates now. There's not really any evidence that that has any impact on voter decisions. The days when that might have had an influence were probably before the modern political system, when the media situation in the United States was very different. The newspapers had more influence. The media were less openly partisan. Today, I think most people, most voters recognize that Fox News has a certain partisan view, MSNBC has a certain partisan view. Everybody understands that when they listen to them, and so they don't really, their decisions aren't influenced by who they're told to support. So those are things that don't matter. Now, before we get into the 10 things that really matter, let's talk about the things that they seem to matter, but sometimes that's misleading, or they matter in ways that people that don't really expect them to matter. They have an unusual effect. The first one is going to be a little surprising, but I think it's true. Every study I've read seems to suggest it's true. With the exception, and we'll talk about this, because right now we're beginning the primary season, and the primary is a little bit different from the general election. Media coverage does not matter. The media have extraordinary interest in the politics. The media have an extraordinary self-interest in promoting audience interest in this, because of course the more people who watch, that means advertising revenue is going to go up. But the fact is that media coverage really does not have an impact on who voters choose. Obviously, it's better to be in the media, as Donald Trump shows. Any media coverage is better than no media coverage. But once we get closer to the actual election, no candidate is going to have a problem appearing in the media. It's only probably about 4 months ago, when some of the candidates who did not have a lot of money or did not have a lot of support, they needed media attention then. Very early in the primary cycle, in the nominating process, candidates need media coverage. The longer they get into it, nobody needs the media to give them coverage. They will generate that coverage automatically. There's a slight exception, which is that, again, just like if you have a sufficient number of the political experts who are talking about one specific issue, and that can drive up public interest in it. If the media decide to focus on a certain issue, that might force the candidates to respond to that issue, which in turn will capture voter attention, and depending on what the issue is, that might have an impact. But directly, it doesn't really seem to be much of an indication that if the media give more attention to this candidate is going to do well, and this candidate will do worse. Generally speaking, the media cancels itself out, media attention. That's partly That's partly because what I was referring to earlier in the case of newspapers and endorsements. Most Americans understand very well now that the media world is very different than it was 40 years ago. When I was a little kid, there were 3 television stations, and they all tried very hard to appear to be more or less politically neutral. We got a lot more than 3 now, and they don't try very hard to appear to be politically neutral. They have fragmented into very clearly defined partisan blocs, and most people like to read or watch or listen to the news that they agree with. That's not necessarily happy news, but I think it's true. When you go out with a group of friends, you probably don't like to go out with people that you disagree with all the time. You would rather be with people that you generally agree with. And the same is true when people talk politics in the United States. If my political views are over here, probably I like watching Fox News because everything they're telling me reinforces what I already believe. These are people I agree with, and if I'm over here, I like to listen to MSNBC, and I like to read the New York Times because probably those opinions more or less coincide with mine. And so then I think, I agree with the New York Times. I must be extraordinarily smart. But if I read something that clashes with that, then I have an uncomfortable situation because either I have to decide, which is what a lot of people do, that those people are obviously stupid because they don't agree with me, or I have to face the uncomfortable fact that maybe I'm not right. And most people don't really like to do that very often. So the media have, to a significant extent, lost their ability to persuade people politically because people already know where they are on the political spectrum. And if I know that the media is over here, and I'm over here, I'm probably not going to believe what they say. There's always an exception. And that would be if something, what I'll call unexpected happens, particularly a scandal. The media do have one potential avenue for influence, which is they can choose to highlight that scandal, or they can choose to bury it. And obviously, if I don't know that the scandal's there, that scandal is not going to have any impact on my vote. If all I hear about all day long is that scandal, that's probably going to influence what I do. So, for example, this is a little bit before the modern times, but the rumor is, obviously we would never say this officially, that President Kennedy might have seen 1 or 2 other women besides his wife during his lifetime. The media never reported on that. President Roosevelt, it was well understood, had a lover who was not his wife. That was never reported in the media. This is not exactly comparable, but it's close enough. When in the 1980s, there was a candidate named Gary Hart who should have been an extremely good candidate. He was young, he was dynamic, he was extraordinarily smart, very good on the issues, he was handsome, he spoke very well, and there were rumors. And he made the very bad decision of challenging the media to say, if you really think that I'm having an affair, follow me and prove it. And they did. And that was not good for his candidacy because the scandal then became very, very public. In a way, Watergate might have been something similar. If the Washington Post had made a different decision, Watergate might never have really become a big political problem, and President Nixon could have avoided it. But instead, for about 1.5 years, from 1973 to 1974, that was all anybody talked about in American politics, and of course Nixon had to resign because of that. So the media do have that, that lever, that potential influence. Another thing that doesn't matter, but they're enormous fun, are the debates. The debates are tremendous fun. Well, up to a point, they're fun. They can also be really boring, but they're usually fun to watch. And this year, just like most years, there will be 3 between the presidential candidates, and the vice presidents will have 1 as well. And this is counterintuitive. It goes against everything you read in the textbooks. But they have done research on this, and the debates don't really seem to make any lasting difference. There will be a temporary movement. And so all of the things you've heard, even the famous Nixon sweating against Kennedy in 1960. It didn't really make any difference in the votes. President Ford said something phenomenally unbelievable in 1976 when he said that no country in Eastern Europe was under Soviet domination. And all of the experts, how can the president say something like it? Zero impact on the polls. Reagan completely crushed Walter Mondale in the debates. He was already going to win. It didn't really make any difference. You've probably seen other famous instances. Usually what happens in a debate is one candidate will do something really wrong, and people like to talk about it because it's funny. So there was the, in the year 2000, when Bush and Gore were debating, there's a separate aspect to this too, but at one point, as then Governor Bush was talking about what he was going to do, in order to show how stupid he thought these ideas were, Vice President Gore, people hated it. It was a terrible thing to do because it appeared arrogant and it appeared dismissive. Didn't make any difference in the polls whatsoever. So it was fun to talk about. It was really fun to watch, but it didn't make any difference. And if you think about it, just 4 years ago, the universal consensus was Governor Romney completely won the first debate against President Obama. Completely crushed him. He went up a couple points. A few days later, right back down to normal. So the debates don't seem to have, there's no evidence that the debates have any lasting impact on what voters will decide to do.
Excuse me, so why do we have the debates then?
Because they're fun.
Okay.
Because, again, I'm just telling you, if you can find a person who's absolutely a voter, who's absolutely objective, who sincerely wants to listen to all of the points of view, and then through some mathematical formula come to a decision and say, okay, I guess I'll vote for that person, that's great. The debate probably mattered to that person. First of all, good luck finding that voter, because most people already have, there are very few people who are absolutely neutral. Most people are a little bit over here, or a lot over here, or a little bit over there, or a lot over there. And the second reason is, we don't have, 150 years ago, Lincoln and Douglas had really great debates that lasted for hours, and they had to give very long explanations of what they thought the problems were and how they were going to fix it. And we have longer attention spans than we do in the age of television. Most of the debates now are not really debates. The debates are, candidate A, I would like to give you 2 minutes to give me a sound bite on your position. And now, candidate B, I'd like to give you 90 seconds to respond to that sound. There are not too many times when it's, okay, candidate A and candidate B, go ahead, ask each other questions, point out the problems in each person's debate, each person's positions. We don't have debates, really. We have structured public presentations of positions. But they're enormous fun. The League of Women Voters continues, God bless them, to think that it's a good civic thing to do, and it is. But the fact is that if what you're looking at, no one's ever shown that there's a direct link between the debates and then what happens. That's all I'm trying to say. But thank you for the question. She gets points for the first question. Since you all know American literature too, you will recognize, you'll remember the name of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who once said that consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds. So I'm going to use that as an excuse to contradict myself. Another thing that doesn't matter in the way that people think that it matters is money. A few months ago, money was extraordinarily important. If you were a candidate who did not have a high level of name recognition, so you're not Donald Trump, you are John Kasich from Ohio, for example. If you don't have a lot of money, it's going to be very difficult for you to rise up and be recognized by the public. So you need that money at the beginning. And people will talk about the importance of the fundraising and the importance of money, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But it's misleading, because the fact is that as the election progresses, Both candidates are going to have plenty of money. That will not be an issue. Nobody is going to lose the election because they didn't have enough money. They might lose the primary. They might lose right now, although they've probably already lost if their problem was they didn't have enough money. But as the campaign moves forward, the money is going to find the candidates. Both of the eventual nominees will have well over $1 billion. It's very possible that one party is going to get closer to $2 billion. You don't need $2 billion. That's great. I'd rather have more money than less money. It's always fun to have. But there comes a point of diminishing returns. There are only so many television commercials that you can air. And in fact, even the television commercials start being counterproductive if the number goes too high. So every candidate will have enough money. So while it's fun when they say that this candidate has raised this much money and this candidate only has this much money, the only thing that really matters is, do they have enough? Have they passed that line that is sufficient? And if they have, how far above the line they go doesn't matter a whole lot, in my view. Okay, and then the last thing that I will contradict myself a little bit later, but for now I'll say it doesn't matter a whole lot, and it doesn't matter the way you think it does, are public opinion polls. Right now, ignore all of them, because they're completely meaningless. Most people are not yet paying attention. It's only been in the last few weeks that people in Iowa and New Hampshire have started paying attention. Now again, the very, very unusual people, the experts, the political addicts, they've been paying attention forever. Because as you know, the political campaign in the United States starts the day after the previous election. So there's some people who've been paying attention a long time. Most people have not. And so when you see a poll 2 or 3 months ago, that maybe a little bit more than 2 or 3 months ago, that has Hillary Clinton here and nobody else close to her, or Donald Trump here and nobody else close to him, that poll is only a poll that measures, do you recognize the name? Nothing else. So you can ignore those. Even as we move into the general election, I would say that you can probably ignore most public opinion polls until about September, because nobody's really thinking that carefully about the campaign yet. We'll know who the candidates are, and again, realistically, most people already know that I'm a little bit over here, and so I'm probably going to support that candidate, or I'm a little bit over here, so I'm probably going to be that way. There's some people in the middle, but it's not 100% of the people. It's not that many people. So most people are just giving you a very quick answer, and they're not really thinking about it yet. Plus, there could still be some things that happen in the campaign. So I would ignore most of the public opinion polls, with one exception. Sometimes you will see surveys that will ask about the favorability or the unfavorability of a candidate. This basically means, do you like that person or do you not like that person? If you have enough time, it's possible to change those numbers, but it's not easy. Usually people have no opinion about candidates at this stage. There are a couple of exceptions. Secretary Clinton, for example, has been a public figure for a very, very long time. And the people who have favorable opinions of her have formed that opinion over 20 years, probably. People who have unfavorable opinions have formed that over 20 years. They're probably not going to change. And the same is true of Mr. Trump, who's been a public figure for quite some time. People tend to have strong views. If a candidate has very low favorable ratings, that's not good, obviously. But if the unfavorable ratings are also low, then it's okay, because what it means is, I don't know him yet. But if a candidate has pretty high unfavorable ratings, that's not good. Because if your unfavorable rating is 48%, that's pretty much guaranteed that 48% of the people are not going to vote for you. So you've got to win almost everybody else if you're going to win the election. So if you see a survey that talks about favorable and unfavorable, that one can be interesting, especially if that number stays fairly consistent. But otherwise, the surveys that you see right now that show Secretary Clinton would beat Rubio by 1 point, but lose to Cruz by 2 points. They don't, those are way too early. I wouldn't worry about this. So those are all the things that don't matter a whole lot or don't really help you a whole lot. So probably I should talk about the things that matter, or otherwise this will not be a very enlightening talk. So as I said, I think there's 10 things that you need to keep in mind. These things matter. I'm going to talk about the first two together, simply because we are about to begin the primary system, and these things affect the primary and the general election. The system and the calendar. The general election is going to be easier to explain, so I'll start with the primaries. And I don't know how much you've looked at this carefully, but as I said, the election starts next Monday in Iowa, and Iowa has something that's called a caucus. Whereas New Hampshire, which votes on February 9th, is going to have a primary. The difference between a caucus and a primary is fundamental. And there are some political analysts who say that it was a failure to really understand how these two systems worked that caused Secretary Clinton's campaign a lot of trouble in 2008 when she lost to then Senator Obama. Caucuses are a much smaller group of people. Caucuses are more or less a town hall of the party in that state. It's organized by the party. The numbers of participation is low. And if the participation is low, what that tells you is those are the fanatics. These are not the casual people. If I want to get you to vote, okay, it's a half hour of your time. Maybe you'll do that, because you just got to go there and make a mark on the paper, and then you're done. If you go to a caucus, you're there all day. So this is people who really, really want their person to win, which means the campaign's organization is extremely important. And sometimes a campaign doesn't have the network of volunteers who are going to bring those people into the school or into the church or into the public library or wherever they're having the caucus. But again, remember when we started talking about the conventions, the whole purpose of these things is to choose delegates. So you've got to win the caucuses and the primaries in order to get delegates. The rules are complicated. Most states have primaries, not all of them. I think 6 of them have caucuses. The way that states determine how many delegates they have is controlled by the state party. The first rule, probably the only rule you really need to understand about US politics is we don't have a national election. Absolutely does not exist. We have state elections. Even when we get to the presidential election, there's no national election. We don't choose by popular vote, as Vice President Gore showed. You've got to win state by state. And in the primaries, that becomes important because the calendar is drawn out. We might not know who wins until the end of April, because we'll see things start a little, and this was a decision by the parties. And if you think about it, it was actually a decision in order to try to make things more democratic. Was if we had an election on the first day and everybody voted, the candidate who's the most famous and who has the most money is probably going to win. The parties tried to draw this process out so that just because Mr. Famous Billionaire wins on day 1, that doesn't mean that I don't have a chance on day 30. And so he's got to keep winning. As I said, the first state that you're going to see is Iowa. Has anybody ever been to Iowa? Iowa is not necessarily representative of the United States as a whole, let's say. It's very agricultural. Ethnically, it's very white. There are not many minorities there. It's more conservative than the usual state. It's more religious than the usual state. So Iowa's unusual. The first state that has a primary is New Hampshire. Anybody ever been there? New Hampshire's colder than the average state, whiter than the average state, more rural, not urban, than the average state. It's in the northeast, so it's sort of a continuation of the early colonial times of the town hall meeting, things like that. These states have relatively low population, and historically they have always wanted the political candidates to go door to door and talk to people, go to the donut shop and sit with 5 people and explain to them why they should be president. It's a lot of time and a lot of work to win votes in these states, and they're not representative. These will be followed by 2 more states in the next couple of weeks, which are also not necessarily representative, but a little bit different. Nevada is, of course, where Las Vegas is, so you have to go into the casino and get everybody to vote for you. South Carolina is in the south, and does have a more ethnically mixed group of voters. So it starts to be a more interesting dynamic. None of them are big states, and none of them give a lot of dynamics. And that was a purposeful decision by the parties, because they wanted to give the voters in the big states a chance to see how the candidates will do. The big states don't vote until May. New York, for example, doesn't vote until April 19th. California doesn't vote until June, when in all probability everybody already knows who's going to win. The other thing that is extremely important about the system, caucuses, you have to be a member of the party, you have to be a resident of the town, and then it's basically, come on, let's go to the caucus and let's try to get our candidate to win. Primaries look more like a regular election, but there are 3 different types. The normal one is called closed, which doesn't sound particularly inviting, but it's no big deal. Closed means that only Democrats get to vote in the Democratic primary, and only Republicans get to vote in the Republican primary, which seems fair enough. Then there's another system called mixed. And mixed means Democrats can vote in the Democratic primary, Republicans can vote in the Republican primary, but if you're an independent, you can vote in either one. And then, since we have closed, we might as well have open. There aren't as many open, but open are interesting, because open means you can vote wherever you want. Historically, sometimes it happens that, let's say that I'm a member of Party A, and my party, we already know who our candidate's going to be. But in the other party, they have a pretty good candidate, and they have a really terrible, terrible candidate. I'm probably going to go vote for the terrible candidate because I want to sabotage that party if I can. That is the possibility of the open primary. The other thing that matters, and as you start seeing the results, I would not care a whole lot who wins Iowa and what percentage they have. There are a handful of consequences. Right now, as you know, there are approximately 700 Republican candidates for president. I might have got that number a little bit high. Not all of them are going to remain candidates after Iowa and New Hampshire. So the number of candidates who quit after those, that's important. Because right now, if you have, for example, 10 people dividing the vote, it's going to be very difficult for anybody to get more than 25, 30% of the vote. But if you move down to 3 or 4 candidates, it's going to become a lot more possible to get a higher percentage of that vote. So you'll see some candidates start to disappear. The other thing that matters, and this is one date you should pay attention to, is March 15th. Because right now, any election that happens before March 15th is going to be more or less like the Polish system in terms of awarding delegates. It's proportional, and there's a threshold. So if you get 5% of the vote or 10% of the vote, then you get a proportion of the delegates. If you get 30% of the vote, you get more or less 30% of the delegates. But after March 15th, although it's a state-by-state decision, we have what's called winner take all, which means if you get the most votes in that primary, you get all the delegates. So you will start to see an acceleration of who's ahead in the delegate count after March 15th. Before March 15th, it would be extremely difficult for one candidate to have enough delegates to matter. Also, we don't have that many delegates to decide. But after March 15th, that number is going to start going up dramatically. So probably by more or less the end of April, where 70% of the delegates will have been decided, you'll have a pretty good idea of who wins. Maybe not mathematically, but you'll have a pretty good view of who has won the election. There's one twist, which is, in terms of the delegates, for reasons that I don't really understand, the Democrats have approximately 4,800 delegates who will go to their convention. For Republicans, maybe it was a budget decision, I don't know. They have about 2,500. These delegates are not all chosen in the primary and the caucus elections, in the primaries. The Democrats have about 700 what they call superdelegates. Superdelegates are not elected. These basically mean members of Congress, party officials, former presidents, can be superdelegates. These people do not have to say at the beginning who they're going to support. So in a hypothetical situation, if you had, let's say, one Democratic candidate who had 1,800 delegates and another who had this many delegates, there's going to be a big fight for these superdelegates. Now, probably what happens, this is what happened last time, in 2008. Once the superdelegates see that one candidate, in this case President Obama, was stronger, the superdelegates tend to move in that direction. But there can still be a fight over that. Okay, I guess that's mostly on the primary. The general election, as I'm sure you know, we do not have a popular vote election. And the calendar is less important. Basically, the calendar is, in July, the conventions. In August, nobody cares because they're all at the beach. The campaigns will start again in September and October. You have approximately 10 weeks of campaign, and then on November 8th, we'll actually have the election. The Electoral College, which I assume everybody's familiar with, means that every state has a certain number of votes. It doesn't matter what the percentage of voter turnout is in the state. It doesn't matter what the margin of victory is. If you win the most votes in that state, you win all of that state's electoral votes. There's two exceptions. They almost never matter, so we won't bother to talk about that. But what this means is, and I'm sure all of you are aware of most of this. We'll put the Democrats on this side, and we'll put the Republicans over here. There are certain states that have a very strong tendency to vote for one party. So let's say Massachusetts. I'm willing to bet you 50 zloty right now that Massachusetts is going to vote for the Democratic candidate. So if everybody wants to go ahead and put their 50 zloty on the table, I'll take it now, because I'm pretty confident this is one I'm going to win. And over here, I'm willing to bet you 50 zloty that Utah's probably going to vote for the Republican candidate. We could actually go through all the states and probably put between 35, 38 of the states in these columns. It's not really much of a mystery. It's been that way since the modern party development happened, which is basically under President Nixon. There's not any big mystery. But you will hear in the media reports talk of the so-called battleground states. We obviously like to use military terminology when we talk about a political campaign because it makes it more exciting. There are two really famous battleground states that have been that way for quite some time. Florida and Ohio. They will probably be battleground states again this time. In other words, they're going to be extremely close, probably only 1 or 2 points separating the candidates. That's where most of the campaigns are going to put their energy. There are a handful of other states, probably 6 or 8 states, that can become battlegrounds. And when I get to the very end, we'll talk about a few more of those, because those matter tremendously. Because basically, if a state like Utah is moving in this direction, basically anything that's to the left of Utah is already way over here. So when some states move into the battleground category, that's probably a really bad sign for the party that usually wins those states. And there are probably 8 to 10 of them this year that have a possible chance of moving. So we'll look at that in a little bit. Okay, other things that matter. Number 3. Remember, I quoted Emerson, so I'm allowed to contradict myself. Money. Money matters, but again, not in the way that most people think. because both campaigns and both parties are going to have way more than $1 billion. That's plenty. There are, as you know, these things. PACs. PACs stand for Political Action Committees. And in the last 2 election cycles, in part because of a Supreme Court ruling concerning campaign finance, which has been a problem in the U.S. For quite some time. We haven't figured out how we want to address that issue. The political action committees, as long as they do not coordinate directly with the campaign, they can pretty much spend as much money as they want. Obviously, they can spend a lot of money, and that can have a lot of influence. Now, usually, they will talk about issues. For example, 20 years ago, George Soros, who you may have heard of, the Hungarian-American investment banker, decided he wanted to help finance a referendum in different states on legalizing marijuana, for example. He could spend as much money as he wanted because he wasn't coordinating with any individual candidate. He was simply saying, I think marijuana should be legal. And he was going to pay money for broadcast advertisements to support that. Karl Rove now has a political action committee, which obviously is going to support, if not explicitly a Republican candidate, it's going to support issues that everybody knows support the Republican candidates. In that same way that media coverage, if they focus on an issue, that can help mobilize voters. If a political action committee puts a lot of money on an issue, for example, gun control or abortion, that might mobilize voters who care a whole lot about that issue, and that can have an impact. So in that sense, the PACs can affect turnout, which is the other word you need to know. Factor number 4 is the strength of the campaign itself, the campaign's organization, because they really only have about 10 weeks. And a campaign, again, your most important resource is not money. It's not even usually people, because both campaigns will have enough volunteers. It's time. They only have 10, 12 weeks tops to identify who the voters that they might be able to get. And that'll be the last thing we look at, are which particular voters. Each campaign is going to be stronger or weaker on those issues. President Obama, for example, is credited with having revolutionized the way that a campaign will identify, almost like a marketing company, identify that person probably will vote for me, and that person probably won't. So I'm going to put all my energy to try to get that person, and then once I've got her, I know that she's got 2 friends sitting right behind her, and I'm going to try to get her to get those people. And the campaign is very good at using a lot of data to identify possible or probable voters and try to get those people in. 3 factors next that are what I would call the fundamentals. And there are some people who will tell you these are actually the only things that matter in an election whatsoever. First one, as Bill Clinton made obvious to everybody, is the economy. That's probably true. Most people basically look at their wallet and they decide, have the last 4 years been good for my wallet or bad for my wallet? And if it's been good, they're probably going to vote for the party in power. If it's been bad, they're probably going to not vote for it. If you want to look at various economic factors, you could look at things like job growth. You could look at the price of gasoline, which matters a whole lot. You could look at complicated statistics on household income. But if you just want the very quick snapshot explanation of the economy, it doesn't matter how good or how bad it is objectively. What matters is it getting better? If it's getting better, that's extremely good for the party in power. If it's not getting better, that's not good for the party in power. The second factor is national security, which, let's face it, is a euphemism for do we have a war or do we have a terrorist attack? That generally favors the Republican Party because it usually favors the more conservative candidate, although not always, because sometimes it'll favor the more experienced candidate. But national security could be a factor as well. There are 2 fundamentals that, well, I won't talk about this. And then the third fundamental that matters are what I would call, think back to the 1988 election. In 1988, the Republicans nominated the vice president, George H.W. Bush. The Democrats nominated Michael Dukakis. So Ronald Reagan wasn't running anymore. He was finished. He could not be the president. But what you had in that election, and this is a very common pattern, is people basically did not vote because of Bush or Dukakis. They basically decided, am I content with the Reagan administration or not? Most people were, and so they voted for the Republican. There are some elections that in effect become a referendum on the incumbent. That's really good news if you're the incumbent, if you're popular. That's really bad news if you're the nominee of a party, for example, John McCain, where the incumbent is not very popular. Because when President George Bush, for example, had a 32% approval rating entering the election, that's pretty hard for the Republican candidate to try to overcome. So that's what happens. There's two indications of whether the election turns into that sort of referendum. And you can find these on any website. The first one, it's still a little bit early, but probably in about 3 months, you'll have enough information to tell. Gallup has historically done a survey on the presidential approval rating. And historically, well, right now, President Obama has 46% approval, 49% disapproval. So he's negative 3.4. Okay, that's not great. It's not disastrous. It's not great. When that number is below 47%, that's usually a very, very bad sign for the party in power. There's still time for that to change. So this is still too early, but in March or in April at the latest, take a look at the presidential approval rating. If it's moving up to 47, 48, that's a very good sign for the Democratic nominee. If it's 46 or 45, that's not a good sign. The second factor, and you'll see this again in surveys all the time, Gallup does it, but a lot of companies do it, is what is called the right track, wrong track survey. Now, I believe the last time I checked the numbers, I think 28% of people thought that the United States, that America was on the right track, and 64% thought we were on the wrong track. That sounds terrible. That's actually kind of normal. That's a negative 35%. Americans are kind of pessimistic on this number. It's usually very, very negative. 4 years ago, when President Obama was running for re-election, at the beginning of 2012, the number was also negative 35%. But by the summer, it had changed to negative 12. Negative 12 is phenomenally great. So if that number, again, it doesn't matter what the number is, but right now it's minus 35. In about 4 months, look at it. If the number is better than minus 35, that's good for the Democrats. If the number has gotten worse, that's not good for the Democrats. So again, it doesn't really matter what the number is, it matters which direction it's moving. Now we're to number 8, since those were 3. Number 8 are what I would call externals. Externals would be, for example, something like what happened in Paris in December. Externals would be the financial crisis in 2008, when just like it seemed like Senator McCain was getting a little bit closer, boom, the economy tanked. Externals are things that the candidate can't control, but if they happen, they can have a devastating effect. Externals can also be, although I don't think it's going to be this year, if there is a serious third-party candidate. Now I know that former Mayor Bloomberg has announced that he's thinking about being a candidate. We'll see. I think it's unlikely that he's going to get a lot of support, but historically, if you need examples of when the third party matters, think back to 2000, when Ralph Nader got 3% of the vote. Obviously, not a lot of Republicans were probably supporting the green, environmental Ralph Nader. Those were probably votes that would have otherwise gone to the Democrat. Ross Perot got 19% of the vote in 1992. President Clinton, at the time Governor Clinton, only got 40% of the vote. Ross Perot votes obviously were coming from then President Bush. So a third-party candidate, if he's very strong, can swing the election. 2 factors left. It seems just polite that I should say that the candidate matters. That's probably true. It doesn't necessarily matter which candidate has the better economic plan or the better military security defense plan, because let's face it, if I'm an average voter, what do I know about how many tanks we need, or how many aircraft carriers we need, or what the best way is to create jobs? So it's difficult for a candidate to win based on an analytical, scientific presentation of their policy, which is why they usually don't do that. Instead, they focus on more general goals of what they're trying to do, and things that they don't like that they'll criticize the opposition for. But there are some things that matter. Remember when I talked about the debate when when Vice President Gore sighed about Governor Bush? It was terrible, because people thought, I don't like that guy. He seems like he's arrogant, he's acting like he's smarter than the other guy. Maybe he is smarter than the other guy, but I don't like it. It's kind of rude to interrupt the guy and sigh when he does something like that. And there was actually a survey that came out that year. And this seems like a stupid way to choose a president, but hey, it's the United States. We get to do things like this if we want to. And the survey was, which candidate would you rather have a beer with? George Bush or John Kerry? George Bush won. And then he won the election. Because I don't want to vote for somebody I don't like. So this likability test kind of matters. I don't have to really love them, but it would be helpful if I don't hate that person. And so you'll see other surveys that are in effect measuring the same thing. Do you trust them? Do you think that they're honest? When somebody's numbers are not very good in that category, that's going to be hard for them to persuade a voter to vote for them. So I don't want to mention any names of the current candidates because this thing's being taped. But obviously, if you've got candidates who have problems in those areas where in effect voters are saying, I don't like that person very much. If you don't like them, you're probably not going to vote for them. You might not vote for the other person, but you're probably not going to vote for that candidate. So candidates matter, obviously. And then, of course, some candidates, like President Obama, for example, some candidates have an extraordinary ability when they speak, an extraordinary ability to connect with the crowd and to deliver a message. President Clinton was another one like that. President Reagan was another one like that. That can only work to their advantage. There are other candidates who, I think it's fair to say, are not quite as great at speaking publicly and connecting with crowds. Both President Bushes were probably in that category. It's not necessarily means you're going to lose, but if you have that ability, like President Obama has, that's obviously better. And you can judge for yourself as you see people at the events. There are clearly some of the candidates this year who have, whether you agree with the policies or not, they have an ability to reach out and connect with the audience. That's a good thing. That's a good thing, because then you're getting people interested. And that brings me to factor number 10, which is ultimately what happens, what matters the most. And that's the voter. I have a cool little diagram because I was thinking about how to explain this. So, that's the United States. It's perhaps not geographically accurate, but it's close enough. And then, don't quite have, well, let's go like this. Let's say that here are my Democrats, my usual Democratic voters. I should have made that a little bit bigger. And let's go halfway. Let's go like that. And then here are the Republicans. And then I'm going to draw another line. If this is 50%, let's draw a line right about here. That's somewhere in the neighborhood of 57 to 62%. And this is, I'm going to call my turnout line. People who are, this is the number of people who are certainly going to vote. Most elections we have, it's around 55 to 60%, depending on how the enthusiasm is. Sometimes it goes up a little bit, sometimes it goes down a little bit. But these people who are below the turnout line, they're going to vote. These people, I got to motivate them. I might not be able to get all of those guys. Somebody who's up here, there's no way this person votes. This guy never votes. He doesn't care. This guy always votes. You can't kill him. If he's the person, you may have noticed 3 days ago Donald Trump said he could shoot somebody in New York City and it wouldn't cost him any votes. If he shot this guy would still go vote. This guy's always going to vote. So, that's more or less my universe. But it's not entirely accurate because I've got people up here, and people down here. And the I means, these people are more or less independent. They don't really have a strong party affiliation. And some of them are, they're definitely going to vote. What I don't know yet is, are they going to go over here? Are they going to go over here? Or are they going to go third party? And then there's some that probably aren't going to vote. But if they do vote, they're either going to go here, or they're going to go here, or they're going to go third party. Those guys could move. Again, these groups are much, much bigger. And then we've got some people, US politics is curious, but we've got some people who are like this, we got some people who are way over here, we got some people who are like that. We have them on both sides. These people are probably not going to support either one of the two major parties. They might, it's not likely. Again, some of them probably aren't going to vote. If they are going to vote, they're either going to go third party or they might go Democrat. Some of them, they might vote, they might not vote, but they're definitely not going to vote for the Democrat. But there is no way they're going to go over here. So these guys probably aren't going to vote for either one of the two parties. And then these guys, same thing, but again, they're below the turnout line. They're probably going to vote, but we don't know yet who they're going to vote for because they're outside the mainstream of the Democrats. And then there's one other group, and it doesn't really matter where I put them, but let's put them here, for example. And this, nobody can see it, but it's SI because it stands for single issue voters. These guys do not cross. Single issue voter is, for example, an abortion rights voter or an anti-abortion voter. If they're anti-abortion, they are only going to be over here. If they're abortion rights, they're only going to be over here, if that's the one issue that motivates them. You can think of other issues that are similar. Gun control, for example, could be one. A handful of people on taxes. And again, you can come up with different issues. But the curious thing about these single issue voters is, in a way, they're married. And they're going to vote or not vote. And remember when we were talking about if the political experts or the media all decide to start talking about a certain issue. Let's say, for example, Bernie Sanders, for example, has made a big issue of gun control this year. Let's say that in the campaign, gun control becomes a very, very important issue. The media are always talking about it. The experts are always talking about it. Now the candidates have to start talking about it. Well, that's going to have a curious effect because it means these people who care about gun control, they're going to vote. Absolutely. And as the issue becomes more and more important, they're going to be more, just absolutely, their turnout line is going to move up. So more than will vote. But same thing's going to happen on this side. In a weird way, I don't want to say they cancel each other out because the fact is these circles are not the same size. But this explains why probably, if you're just looking from cold political calculus, if gun control were to become a big, big issue, most Americans do not support gun control. And so if it became an issue that people are going to vote on, that's great, that these guys all vote. The problem is this circle's a lot bigger than that circle, and those guys are all going to vote too. So sometimes it's not politically a good idea to focus on a single issue. You want to make sure that the single issues that are being raised are the single issues that favor your side and don't favor the other side. And so at the end of the day, keeping in mind the Electoral College, what really matters if you're a campaign and you've only got 10 weeks, 12 weeks to try to do this, let's say that you're the Democrat. Although that would be, I have to be nonpartisan. We're going to call this Party A and Party B, because now I don't want to be partisan. Let's say I'm over here. I'm feeling pretty good about these guys. They're going to vote for me. They're below the turnout line. They're in my camp. Okay. I got to make a decision here. If I get these people, is this going to, in effect, give the other guy more votes? And if it is, I'm probably not going to hit this issue very hard. I got these people here who could go either way. So obviously, I want them, especially these people, because these people are going to vote. And I don't want them going over here. I need them coming over here. I'm going to try to get all of these people who are below the turnout line, in other words, who are probably going to vote, who historically have voted. I have to mobilize all of my people. I have to get as many of these people who can go either way as possible. If they're out here, I'm not going to win them, but I don't care because they're not going to vote for the other person. If they're over here, I'm not going to win them, but I don't care. They're not going to vote for the other person. So any campaign is a combination of two strategies. I want to maximize my people as much as I can. I want to raise my turnout line, but only on my side. And let's face it, the reason you hire professional political consultants is because they know how to do this. I don't really want these guys to vote because they're not going to vote for me. I want to try to lower the turnout line in my opponent's camp. I want to discourage them from voting. And there might be different ways I can do that. I can run a really negative campaign because most people don't like negative campaigns and the turnout tends to drop. There could be other ways that I could try to make those people, in effect, lose confidence in their candidate. And so that's why I'll spend some of my time attacking, because I don't want them to vote. So those are the 10 factors. Now I'll give you the 5 easy ways to tell. We've already talked about one. In the next 6 weeks, many of the candidates, especially on the Republican side, are going to disappear. How fast they do that and how many of them do that is going to be extremely important for deciding who wins. Right now, for example, Donald Trump tends to be somewhere around 33% in most surveys. Okay, 30% is great if there's 7 or 8 or 10 candidates. 30% is not good if there's only 3 candidates. So it depends how fast those other candidates leave. As we already said, in March, maybe the beginning of April, take a look at the presidential approval rating, especially if it's moving up a little bit, or if it's moving down a little bit. That will tell you an indication of is it good or is it bad for the Democratic Party. Same thing a couple months later, maybe in May, on the economic indicators. At right track, wrong track. If it's moving in a more optimistic direction, good news for the Democrats. Moving in a more pessimistic direction, really bad news for the Democrats. Ignore the national polls until late September, because that's when the campaigns start mattering. And then if there's only one thing you want to look at, and you don't want to start looking now because it's too early, you can wait. You can wait until early October. And when we've talked about those battleground states, again, we already know that Florida and Ohio are definitely battlegrounds. There's no question. They always are every year. I don't have my notes, I'll just have to do it from memory. Let's put it this way. And the Republicans are over here, the Democrats are over here. This is North Carolina. North Carolina probably votes Republican. But if you start seeing surveys that show North Carolina is extremely close between the two candidates, that's extremely bad news for these guys and extremely good news for those guys. If, on the other hand, let's take a state like New Mexico. New Mexico usually leans Democratic. If New Mexico starts being very, very close, again, that's a bad sign for the Democrats. They do not want this state to become a battleground. If you see any of these 4 states, Iowa, New Hampshire, Florida, Ohio, that's normal. They're always battlegrounds. If you see, maybe I should write these out. If you see Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, Nevada, or Pennsylvania, if these states are being talked about as battlegrounds, good news for the Republicans, bad news for the Democrats, because probably, all else being equal, they're going to lean a little bit Democratic. President Obama won those states. If, on the other hand, even though President Obama won this state, if you see a state like Virginia, which of late has been moving a little bit more Democratic under President Obama, if Virginia moves into the battleground, that's not good for the Republicans because they need that state. If they lose it, they've got to take some of the states over here, and it's harder for them to do. So keep an eye on which, let's see, should there be any other states that, what else? Other states, Missouri. Missouri should lean slightly Republican. If it's moving battleground, that's not good for the Republicans. I guess you could say too, it's less likely, Arizona. I think the rest of them are pretty, I think. I think that's most of the ones that are likely to move. So that's your cheap, easy indication and the lazy way. If you want to wait until October, and then you can tell who's going to win. If states that should be on my side start drifting battleground, that's not good for me. I'm probably going to lose. If states that should be Dr. Mazur's start drifting into battleground, that's great for me. And it's terrible for her because it means she's got to start putting resources into protecting her own territory. So that's how you know who's going to win. So now you know.